A man stood on millions of screens, but was never truly seen. For years, audiences watched Jay Silverheels ride beside Tonto, loyal, silent, and always in the shadow of the Lone Ranger. To the world, he was a sidekick. But behind the calm face, there was a story no one told. A story of pride, of pain, of a man who carried the weight of an entire people on his shoulders, while being asked to say less, feel less, and be less. Why did he accept a role that would define him and trap him? And what did it cost him to finally speak the truth? Because the real story of Jay Silverheels is not about a sidekick. It's about a man who refused to stay silent forever. Long before the cameras, before the lights, and before the name Jay Silverheels was known around the world, there was a boy named Harold J. Smith. He was born into a quiet Mohawk community in Canada, a place where life moved at a slower pace. The land was not just home, it was identity. Every tree, every river, every story passed down through generations carried meaning. In this world, Harold was not invisible. He belonged. But outside that community, things are different. The world beyond did not always listen. It did not always care. Opportunities were limited, especially for Indigenous men. Dreams were often replaced by survival. And for Harold, the future was uncertain. Still, he carried something strong inside him, discipline. As a young man, he found his strength in sports. Lacrosse became more than just a game. It was focus. It was pride. It was a way to prove himself in a world that rarely gave him a chance. On the field, he moved with confidence. He earned respect not through words, but through action. People noticed, but respect did not always open doors. Even with talent, even with determination, there were limits placed on him, limits he did not choose. The path ahead was narrow, and every step forward felt like a fight. Then, something unexpected happened. Hollywood came calling. It was not a loud moment, not a grand announcement, just a quiet opportunity, one that felt almost unreal. For many, it might have seemed like a dream, but for Harold, it felt like something else. A chance, a way out of the small box the world had placed him in, a way to be seen, to be heard. So he took it. He stepped away from the familiar and into a world he did not yet understand. A world of scripts, cameras, and carefully written stories. At first, it felt like progress, but slowly, something began to shift. Because in Hollywood, not every opportunity is freedom. Some are roles, and some roles come with invisible walls. The boy who once ran freely across open fields was now stepping into a space where every move, every word, would be controlled by someone else. And he didn't know it yet. But the role that would make him famous would also begin to define him in ways he could not escape. What seemed like a breakthrough would soon become a trap, because the role waiting for him was not just a character. It was a box. And the real question was, who built it? By the time Jay Silverheels stepped into Hollywood, the system was already built, and it was not built for truth. It was built for control. Studios decided the stories. Writers shaped the voices. And actors, no matter how talented, were expected to follow the script exactly as it was written. So when Jay was offered the role of Tonto in The Lone Ranger, it felt like something big. For the first time, a native actor would be seen across the country in millions of homes. It looked like progress. It looked like a breakthrough. But from a very beginning, something was off. Tonto was not written as a full person. He was quiet. He spoke in short, broken sentences. He followed, rather than led. He stood beside the Lone Ranger, but never truly next to him. Still, Jay said yes, because saying no meant going back to closed doors, back to being unseen. This role, even with its flaws, gave him something he had never had before, a platform. So he played the part, and he played it well. The show became a massive success. Children watched every episode. Families gathered around their televisions. Tonto became a familiar face, a trusted figure, someone people felt they knew. But what they saw was not the full truth. Behind the scenes, Jay carried a quiet weight. He understood what the role meant, not just for him, but for his people. Every line he spoke, every action he took, shaped how millions would see Native Americans. And yet, he had little control over that image. Day after day, scene after scene, he followed the script. But inside, questions began to grow. Was this helping? Or was it reinforcing something harmful? The success of the show made it harder to step away. The more popular Tonto became, the more locked in Jay felt. Fame brought visibility, but not freedom. He was finally being seen, but not as himself. And that realization began to settle deep within him, growing heavier with each passing episode. Because sometimes the hardest roles to escape are the ones that bring you the most success. As the Lone Ranger reached its peak and Tonto became a household name, Jay faced a painful truth. Was he opening doors for his people or quietly helping to keep them closed? Fame arrived quickly for Jay Silverheels. His face was everywhere. His voice, carefully shaped by scripts, echoed through living rooms across the country. As Tonto, he became one of the most recognized figures on television. Children admired him. Adults trusted him. To millions, he was a hero. But fame can be deceiving, because recognition is not the same as respect. Off-screen, Jay's world looked very different. The same man who appeared strong and steady on television still faced barriers in real life. Doors did not suddenly open. Roles did not suddenly improve. In fact, they stayed almost exactly the same. Producers saw him as one thing, and one thing only: the quiet man, the loyal sidekick, the character who stood in the background. No matter how much talent he had, the offers he received followed a pattern. Again and again, he was asked to play roles that echoed Tonto. Roles with fewer words, less depth, less humanity. It was as if the character had begun to replace the man. And that truth cut deep, because the world loved Tonto, but they did not fully see Jay. Inside, a quiet pressure began to build. He carried two heavy weights at once. On one side was Hollywood, expecting him to stay the same, to repeat the role that brought success. On the other side was something more personal, a growing awareness that his work was shaping how people saw his culture. Some praised him for breaking barriers. Others questioned the image he helped create. And Jay felt caught in the middle. He had worked so hard to be seen, but now that he was visible, he was not fully understood. The platform he once saw as an opportunity now felt complicated, both a gift and a burden. With each passing year, the silence became harder to carry, because staying quiet was no longer just part of the role. It was becoming part of his reality. And deep down, he knew something had to change. But change comes with risk, and risk can cost everything. Would he continue protecting the role that made him famous, or find the courage to speak out and risk losing it all? For years, Jay Silverheels had followed the script. He had said the lines, hit the marks, played the role exactly as it was written. And in doing so, he became a familiar face to millions. But something inside him had been building quietly, steadily, patiently, and eventually it could not stay silent anymore. Jay began to speak, not as Tonto, but as himself. He started to address what many had ignored for years: the way Native Americans were shown on screen, the stereotypes that reduced them to simple, one-dimensional figures, the broken language that made them seem less intelligent, the lack of dignity in roles that were supposed to represent real people. These are not small concerns. They were deep, painful truths, and speaking them out loud changed everything. Because Hollywood was not used to being questioned, especially by someone inside the system. Jay's words made people uncomfortable. They challenged a structure that had been accepted for decades. For the first time, he was no longer just part of the machine. He was pushing against it. He helped form organizations that called for better representation. He stood alongside others who wanted change. Together, they began to demand something simple, yet powerful: respect. This was no longer about acting. It was about identity. It was about truth. But truth comes with a cost. The more he spoke, the more the industry pulled back. Offers became fewer. Opportunities began to fade. The same system that once gave him a platform now seemed to close its doors. Quietly, firmly, as if reminding him of the price of speaking out. Still, Jay did not stop, because by now, the stakes had changed. This was no longer just about his career. It was about the image of an entire people. about how future generations would be seen and how they would see themselves. Going back to silence was no longer an option, even if it meant standing alone, even if it meant losing everything he had worked for. He had spent years being heard without truly speaking. Now, he was finally speaking and risking being unheard. As Hollywood turned away and the spotlight began to fade, a new battle began to rise. One that would not be fought on a stage or a screen, but within his own body and his own spirit. As the spotlight slowly dimmed, the real struggles of Jay Silverheels began to surface, quietly, away from the cameras. To the world, he was still Tonto, strong, calm, unshaken. But real life does not follow a script. And this time, there were no retakes. Health issues began to take hold. His body, once powerful and athletic, no longer moved the same way. The energy that once carried him across fields and onto film sets started to fade. Simple moments became harder. Days felt longer. Life slowed down. And with that stillness came something heavier. Reflection. Jay had spent years being recognized, but not truly understood. People knew his face, his voice, his character, but not the man behind it. That quiet distance stayed with him, even as the world moved on to new stars, new stories. There was a loneliness in that space, a feeling of being seen, but not fully known. Yet even in these difficult moments, he did not let go of what mattered most. His mission remained. He continued to stand for better representation. He stayed connected to the cause he had fought for, even when his strength was fading. The fight was no longer loud or public, but it was still there, steady and real. Because by now, his story had changed. It was no longer about fame. It was about meaning, about what he had left behind, and what he still hoped to change. The man who once carried a role was now carrying something far greater, a legacy. And legacies are not built in comfort. They are built in struggle, in sacrifice, in quiet persistence. Even as his time in the spotlight faded, his impact did not disappear. If anything, it became deeper, more important, more human. But there was still one question that lingered unanswered. Because while the world remembered Tonto, it was still unclear if they would ever truly understand Jay. As his journey moved closer to its final chapter, one question remained. When the mask is finally gone, will the world see the truth or only the character he was forced to play? Time has a way of changing how stories are told. Years after Jay Silverheels stepped out of the spotlight, people began to look back and see things differently. What once felt simple no longer seemed so clear. For decades, Tonto had been remembered as a loyal companion, a quiet figure beside a louder hero, a character many grew up watching without question. But now, questions were finally being asked. Historians began to study the role more closely. Critics revisited old episodes. Fans looked again, not with childhood eyes, but with deeper understanding. And slowly, the conversation began to shift. What did Tonto really represent? Was he a symbol of progress or a reflection of limitation? And in the middle of those questions stood Jay, a man who had taken a role that opened doors, but also exposed the truth about the system behind them. A man who worked within the limits of his time, yet still found the courage to speak against them. People began to recognize something important. He had not just played a character. He had carried a burden. Every scene, every line, every moment on screen had come with a hidden weight, the responsibility of representation in a world that rarely got it right. And despite that pressure, he chose to speak out. That choice began to matter more than ever. Slowly, respect grew, not just for what he did on screen, but for what he stood for off it, for the risks he took, for the voice he used when it would have been easier to stay quiet. His story was no longer seen as simple success. It became something more complex, more human, more real, a story of both progress and pain, of doors opening and the cost of walking through them. And as people continued to reflect, one truth became clear. Jay Silverheels was never just Tonto. He was something far greater. But even with this growing respect, one question still refused to fade. Because every legacy carries two sides. Was his journey a victory that helped change the future, or a warning about the price of being seen, but not truly understood? In the end, the story of Jay Silverheels is not simple. It does not fit into one clear idea. Not hero, not victim, not just a success story. It is something in between. He was a pioneer, one of the first Native actors to step into millions of homes through television. At a time when few people like him were given that chance, he became visible. He became familiar. He became a symbol. But symbols can be complicated, because while he gave the world Tonto, a character they would never forget, he also revealed something deeper, something harder to face. The cost of being seen in a way that is not fully real. On the surface, his journey looked like progress. A man breaking barriers, a role that reached across the country, a face that people trusted. But underneath, there was tension. The role that made him famous also limited him. It shaped how people saw not just him, but an entire culture. It turned something rich and complex into something simple, something controlled. And for a long time, that version became the truth in the eyes of the audience. But Jay did something important. He did not let that be the final story. Later in life, he used his voice, not the one written in scripts, but his own. He spoke about dignity, about respect, about the need for real representation. He challenged the very image that had made him famous. And that is where his true impact lies. Not just in the role he played, but in the truth he chose to tell. Because changing a story from the inside is not easy. It takes courage to stand in a system, benefit from it, and still question it. That was his quiet strength. Today, his voice still echoes, not in the short, broken lines of Tonto, but in the powerful message he left behind. A message about identity, about truth, about the importance of being seen for who you really are. And maybe that is what makes his story so important. Not because it is perfect, but because it is real, because it forces us to look closer, to question what we see, to ask what lies beneath the surface of every story we are told. So now, when we look back at Tonto, were we really seeing a hero, a stereotype, or a man quietly trying to change the story from the inside?